Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you're a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoy today's session, Housing and Renting 101, helping community sponsors and volunteers understand and teach clients about the rental process. Go on to the next slide, please, or actually one more. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Okay, you can go to the next slide, please. Just some housekeeping. As a reminder for everyone joining the call today, there's a control panel in your upper right-hand corner that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box so we can assist you. Additionally, the presentation, any resources, and a recording will be sent to everyone following today's webinar. This brings us to our presenter for today, Lynette Pearl, Senior Associate of Housing from Refugee Housing Solutions. Lynette, thank you so much for being here, and I'll go ahead and pass it on to you.
Well, thank you, Derek, for having me. Thank you, everyone. Before we begin for today's presentation, when I talk about property landlords, that will include property managers and housing providers. So just FYI through the presentation. So if you hear the word landlord, that will include property managers and any type of entity that are provide housing, affordable housing. So let's get started. Let's talk about our agenda. Next slide. We're going to talk about what are the pre-rental questions we have to ask before we start the rental process. We're going to talk about the rental application. We're going to talk about the key things to review in the lease. We're also going to talk about what is the landlord and the tenant responsibilities, because both sides have responsibilities in order to make this relationship work. Then we're going to go on and briefly go into what is the move-in process and also the move-out process. And we're going to provide you with some community resources for renters. So just in case, if you have a client that falls in a little bit of trouble when it comes to paying their rent, what type of resources are out there that they can get some assistance? Next slide. The rental process is not complicated, but before it begins, key information is needed, such as what can a client can afford? Where is the client going to be located? What type of size unit does the client needs? And what type of properties will they qualify for? So these are the key questions you have to ask when you start the rental process. Next slide. Talk about the most important thing is because we're here to provide affordable housing and affordable housing solutions. So we have to talk about a budget. So let's break down what a budget is and what affordable budget looks like. So to determine what a client can afford, you need to calculate all of their monthly expenses first to create a budget. The budget should include all the client's monthly financial obligations before rental expenses. If you use the 50-30-20 rule, you will be able to determine affordability. So let's start with the 50-30-20 allocation. The allocation states that 50% of one's income after taxes should go towards needs and 30% towards wants, and the remaining 20% for savings and additional debt payment. So let's look at our example, because I'm an example type of person. So let's look at Miss I Need a Home. Miss I Need a Home earns $2,500 per month after taxes and has the following expenses. She has $100 for daycare, $200 for a monthly car note. Monthly, she has $50 for a monthly car insurance and $150 for her groceries. The above need expenses are a total of $500 per month. Based on the 50-30-20 allocation, Miss I Need a Home has $750 available for rent. Another affordable equation you can use is the 30% rule of thumb, where the client should not spend more than 30% of their income on rent. I prefer the 50, 30, 20% method because it allows you to see your client's expenses and it opens up the door to provide resources to help bring those expenses down. Next slide. Now affordability has been determined. You and the client should list what amenities are needed to house them comfortably. During this discussion, if you find the client is requesting a want instead of a need, you should inform them that wants come with an expense and the goal is for them to be housed in a safe, sanitary, affordable unit. Needs vary from person to person, and what you think is a need should not overshadow theirs unless it's necessary for them to live comfortably. Sometimes when we're trying to help clients find housing, we express our needs versus their needs. So you have to be careful in that area. Below are standard needs that should be considered during the rental process. Size of unit. When consider the size of the unit and number of bedrooms, make sure the family size will follow the state and local occupancy limitations. Best practices, 2 heartbeats to a room. Knowing local occupancy requirements will come in handy during the leasing process. Before a client signs a lease, ensure that the family size complies with the occupancy requirements. You can find occupancy requirements by contacting the local housing authority or city code enforcement agencies. Accessibility. Knowing your client's accessibility will narrow down the search and determine if the unit is appropriate. During the leasing phase, certain adjustments can be requested under a reasonable accommodation to make the unit or amenities inside the unit accessible, such as putting in grab bars in a bathroom or assigning accessible parking space for a client with mobility restrictions. Amenities. Amenities include amenities in the house should be low priority, but local amenities should be considered during the search, such as does the client have access to grocery stores, laundromats, cafes, and parks. A client having access to such amenities increase their social trust and a sense of community. Access to public transportation is a big one. Public transportation is a lifeline that provides a way for a refugee and a newcomer to have access to essential services. If the client does not have transportation, it is important to find rentals that have access to public transportation with a good walk score. Next slide, please. Okay. By knowing the different types of affordable housing sources and subsidies, you will know what type of documentation is required for an application. So we're going to go over the different types of housing sources because this is going to help you tell your client what they need to collect to do the application. Okay, so let's talk about market rate properties. Market rate properties are non-subsidized properties for which a client will pay the full market rate. So for example, if the rent is $800, they will pay the full $800. Public housing programs are funded through HUD, but are administered by a local housing authority and are available for low-income families and individuals whose household income is less than 80% of the area's median income. The public housing program also includes a housing choice voucher program, which is formerly known as Section 8. If this family meets the income guidelines, non-citizens, I'm going to repeat this again, non-citizens with certain statuses are eligible for federal rental assistance programs, and this includes refugees. Refugees qualify for federal rental assistance programs, which include public housing, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, project-based Section 8, and eligible designated rural rental assistance programs. So let's talk about what project-based Section 8 rental properties are, because I don't want you to, some people get those confused with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. They are government-funded programs that provide rental assistance to low-income families in privately owned and managed rental units. These programs are, the subsidy is tied to the unit, not the individual, unlike the Housing Choice Voucher. With the Housing Choice Voucher, the subsidy stays with the individual. So if you locate this type of property for a client or you lease them up, you have to explain that once they leave that unit, they no longer have a subsidy. So you need to make sure you explain that to your client before you lease them up. Because you have a lot of people lease up in project-based units, and they think, well, once I leave, I can take that subsidy with me, and you can't. So you got to make sure that's clear. And then also there's Section 811 supportive housing. Now, these are properties that provide subsidized rental assistance and supportive services for individuals with disabilities to live independently in the community. This program is for households with income with 30% below AMI. So there's a restriction with this particular program, and at least one adult in the household has to have a disability to qualify. And we're going to talk about the low income housing tax credit property. It's an apartment complex where the housing project owner and the developer gets a tax credit in exchange that can provide affordable housing for low income families. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Once a unit and a housing type have been identified, now the application process can begin. Due to the shortage of affordable housing, the application process is very competitive, and how a client fills out this form can significantly affect how quickly they can get housed. So it's important that they have all the documentation that's required to complete that application, because I'm telling you, me being on the other end of this, if I get an application and a documentation, I don't have the documentation, I'm going to move on to the next. So it's very important that you make sure that your client has all the documentation that's required for that application. Next slide, please. I think we skipped one. We skipped a slide. There we go. Up one. Another up one. We skipped a slide. There we go. Most landlords require documentation a newcomer and a refugee most likely won't have. However, there are other documentations newcomers can use to accommodate their screening criteria. And here is a list of this. The table lists the criteria used by most landlords during the application process with the alternative documentation newcomers can use to satisfy those screening standards. So let's go into the proof of identity, okay? Newcomers receive their social security cards soon after arrival, along with the I-94 card. This documentation should meet the proof identity during the screening criteria. Ability to pay. Because newcomers have no credit or employment history, they can obtain a promissory note detailing the financial assistance they will receive from a local resettlement office to prove their ability to pay. Criminal history. Newcomers are the most vented people, so the I-94 card proves that the newcomer does not have a criminal background, and that meets their criminal history screening criteria. And it's very important that you tell your clients what the criteria is and what alternative paperwork will meet that criteria, because when they're applying for an apartment, they need to advocate for themselves. Because I'm gonna be honest with you, there's a lot of landlords out there, they're not educated that this particular documentation meets their screening criteria. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, before filling out a rental application, the client must collect that documentation we just talked about, because it's very imperative they get it in on time. So get the documentation collected. If you're helping your client apply for apartments, make sure you have everything that we talked about. Get that collected first before you apply. And so here's the basic application process. Of course, there's going to be a fee. Now, there is going to be a fee if it's a market rate unit that client is applying for. Now, if the client is applying for public assistance, there should not be a fee. There should not be an application fee. There might be a waiting list, but not an application fee. So FYI. So these are the things that's going to be required for, this is if you're going to apply for a market rate apartment. However, if you're going to apply for public housing or project base, you need to contact that individual project-based program because there might be additional documentation they're going to require. So let's go ahead and we talked about the rental application process. I'm going to skip ahead. Let's talk about, can I get to the next slide? The most important thing is the lease. This is the most important thing, is the lease. So you went through the process, you did the application, and your client is leased up. So let's talk about the lease. And again, leases will vary due to different states. So I'm going to just talk generically. And if I hit a section that is specific, I'll let you know you need to check your state statutes when it comes to that particular area, okay? For a client to be successful renter, they need to understand their lease and that it is a binding legal agreement between them and their landlords. Before a client signs a lease, there are vital things in the lease they need to review and verify. So let's look at about the terms. The lease terms vary again from state to state, but the common lease term is a year, with short-term leases being 3 to 6 months. Depending on the duration of the lease, you can determine if the lease is a rental agreement or, if it's a lease or rental agreement. A rental agreement term is 30 to 90 days. That's what a rental agreement is. And leases are 6 to 18 months. Now, you probably say, well, what's the big deal? The big deal is because the longer the lease is, the lower the rent should be. Okay. So let's talk about the start date of a lease and the end date. The start date of a lease is when it is legally binding. A lease typically starts on the first of the month. However, it's not uncommon for a lease to start mid-month. So that's not uncommon, okay? Many times a lease ends on was stated in the lease, but not always. This is important, some leases automatically renew unless it's written in the lease. So most leases require that the renewal notification is 30 to 60 days before the end date. We'll talk about why that's so important. So when you look at your start date of the lease and the end date, those two dates are going to be vital and when you look at your renewal process and also when you do a notice to vacate. We'll talk about that. So many times a lease ends on the date that states in the lease, but not always. That varies from state to state, okay? Some leases automatically renew unless it's written in the lease. Most leases require the renewal notification between 30 to 60 days before the end date. So let's look at our example. Miss I Need a Home leases ends on 12/30/22, and the lease requires a 30-day renewal notification. Based on the renewal policy, she would need to give a notice on 11/30/22 that she will renew her lease. Knowing a company's notice to vacate and renewal policies is essential because the lease end date will determine when the notice to vacate should be given to the landlord if there will not be a lease renewal. We'll talk about that because if you do not give enough notification based on a notice to vacate, your landlord can still tie you into a lease. So that's why you have to make sure you read that part of your lease. Okay, we're going to talk about the rent amount and late charges. The rent amount and the due date should be reviewed before signing the lease. With market rate properties, rates can change. So you might be quote one rate when you call in and finish the application, and it might jump to another rate when you actually sign the lease. So you got to make sure whatever you agree to before you sign the lease, that is the lease amount. Now, with income-based properties, your income, your 30% of your income will be the rent amount during the signing. So if you are leasing up for public housing or a project-based apartment, your lease will always be 30% of your income. So that will be your lease amount. It is imperative to check the due date because it will determine when a late charge will be imposed in the financial penalty. No late fee can be collected unless it is in the rental agreement or addendum. With the Late Fee Fairness Amendment Act, okay, this is for all states, a landlord can only charge up to 5% of the rent in a late fee. If a tenant receives a rental subsidy, now if they're in public housing, that fee is going to be a little bit different. It's calculated based on the tenant's portion of the rent. So their rent fees are going to be totally different from somebody who's paying market rate. But there is a legal cap that they can charge you for late fees, okay? Method payment is very important. because it outlines, it should be outlined in the lease. Larger property management companies usually receive their payments online through a portal, which requires a client to have an e-commerce method of payment, such as a debit card or a net banking card. So you need to make sure you look at that lease with their method of payment. And if some, because I have seen some properties, they only take it online payments. So if your client does not have a means to pay online, you would have to assist them setting that up so they can pay their rent. Can I get to the next slide, please? The security deposits have some legal limitations on the amount a landlord can collect. Again, it varies from state to state, but the common practice is 1 month's rent, with some landlords charging an additional month due to an applicant's credit history. Because you're dealing with a different population that does not have a history, you might have some landlords that charge a larger deposit. Utilities included, you have to look at that in the lease, because sometimes utilities are covered in the monthly lease, but sometimes they're not. For example, water, trash removal are sometimes covered, but other services are not. So you need to make sure when you look at that lease, what will the landlord cover and what will the tenant will cover as well, your client. So they need to know you have to pay the electricity, and this is the part that your landlord will be paying. And this is another big thing in the lease is the occupancy. This is a part of the lease that lists who can occupy the unit and the occupancy requirements for the unit. Sometimes this can get a little sticky when you have bigger families. So you want to make sure you look at what's their occupancy requirements in that lease to make sure you don't violate it. And you also want to make sure you don't have unauthorized occupants in the lease, because that could be a term for you to get a client to be evicted if they violate that part of the lease. I'm gonna get a drink of water. Okay, we gotta talk about appliances that are included. The lease will list what appliances are included in the unit. Most rentals come with white goods appliances, such as refrigerators, stove, dishwashers, and microwave. Whatever that's provided in that unit, that means that that landlord is responsible for the maintenance of it. Because you can have some places you lease a house up and there's no refrigerator or stove, and you are required to bring that in, then that means you're responsible for the maintenance of it. Okay, we're going to talk about early termination fees, which is very important. Lease agreements include an early termination clause that is in place to protect landlords if a tenant decides to break a lease. It often outlines the circumstances for a lease to be broken and includes specific fees that may be required to pay. Early termination fees are 1 to 2 months of rent, with some leases requiring buying out the remainder of the lease. So you need to look at, if I break my lease, what is the financial penalty? And a lot of people don't look at that. In some leases, they will, even though you break the lease, they will require you to pay out the remainder of your lease. So you need to make sure you look at that piece. Because again, it is a binding contract and it has a hefty financial consequence. But however, even though there's certain conditions where you can break your lease. One of the things you can break your lease is if the landlord is if you're being harassed by the landlord, or if the rental unit is unsafe and unhabitable and it violates health or safety codes. You have every legal right to break your lease. Another way you can break your lease without a financial penalty, if you're a victim of domestic violence. So your landlord has to let you out your lease if you are a victim of domestic violence. They cannot hold a financial penalty and hold you accountable for the remainder of your lease if you're a victim of domestic violence. Okay. Another thing you need to make sure you look at your lease is renter insurance. Some properties require you to have renter insurance. That's part of your lease, so make sure you look at that. And the notice of entry. Again, this varies from state to state. When we talked about earlier about harassment, if there's something in your lease where the landlord has to give you 24 hours notification before entering your unit, unless it's a maintenance issue, then they can enter your unit. But if they're saying that we have to give you 24-hour notice before enter your unit, and you find out your landlord is just popping up on you unexpectedly, that's harassment without notification, unless it's an emergency. So you got to make sure you look at that and you tell your clients, if your landlord has to give you advance notice, They cannot pop up at your unit unexpectedly, unannounced, without it being in writing. Subletting, you need to look at the subletting rules. Unit modifications, this is a big one. Part of the lease explains the process and the parameters of unit modifications. Modifications should not be made to a unit without the written approval of the landlord. If a client makes modifications to a unit with the approval from the landlord, so if you do get it from the landlord, I recommend you take pictures and you get it in writing, because that's going to affect you getting your deposit at the end in your move out. So make sure if you do get approval from your landlord, get that in writing, because you don't want your landlord, so yeah, go ahead and make the modifications. Then when you move out, they keep your security deposit. And make sure you read all the addendums in your lease and the visitor policy. That's another big thing. To avoid a lease violation regarding visitors, this outlines the length, how long a visitor can stay, because if you go past that time period in the lease, your landlord can start proceedings to terminate your lease because you violate the policy, the visitor policy. And another one is a pet policy. You got to make sure if you have a pet, do they allow the pets? Also the restrictions, sometimes even with dogs, the breed and the weight. So make sure you look at that. That's very important, because if you do not meet that criteria, your landlord has every right to terminate your lease. Next slide. So we talked about the key things to look at in the lease, the very important things. Again, in order for this relationship to work, there's responsibilities on both sides. In order for it to be a win-win, the landlord is responsible by abiding by the fair housing laws and the Fair Credit Act, Reporting Act. They also have to follow the terms of your lease. They have to make sure they keep the property safe, sanitary, and habitable. Keeping common areas clean, paying common area utilities, ensuring that safe, quiet environment for all tenants to enjoy, establishing working relationship with tenants, and your clients have a responsibility too. They have to follow the terms of their lease, keeping their unit safe and sanitary, maintaining household of the units, and also maintaining appliances supplied by the landlord, and respecting their neighbors and ensuring safe and quiet environment. Another thing I need to add in there is to make sure they pay their rent on time. That should be added in there as well. So I apologize that I left that out. So paying their rent on time is part of their responsibilities as a tenant. So next slide. So I'm gonna have to talk about the ugly thing about the rental process is evictions. Again, this varies from state to state, so you would need to check your state depending on the evictions. So I'm just going to use the generic. Demand for rent. If the tenant fails to pay rent when it's due, the landlord can give the tenant a demand for rent. This demand must inform the tenant that rent is due, so it has to be in writing. And if the tenant does not pay it, the landlord will terminate the rental agreement. This has to be in writing. So you can't have landlord just come and walk by you and say, well, I'm going to evict you. No, everything that, when it comes to eviction process, there is a tier and everything has to be in writing. So if you find that your client has a landlord that's harassed them and not giving anything in writing, is to say, I'm going to get rid of you, I'm going to put your things out, or if you don't give me this amount of money, that's harassment. It has to be in writing, it has to be tracked. And it has to be a letter to prove what they owe before they can start the eviction process. There's a 10-day notice to vacate. Again, some states, there's only 5 days, but there's 10 days general. But you make sure you check with each state, depending on each state, because it's between 5 to 10. In some cases, the landlord can give the tenant a 10-day notice. This notice will inform the tenant that the tenant has 10 days to move out the rental unit, or the landlord will file an eviction lawsuit. A lot of confusion is with this notice to vacate, because a lot of people think, well, I'm about to get evicted. No, it's saying we're going to allow you to leave the unit without filing eviction on you. So it's like giving you this period to voluntarily exit the unit. I recommend, if a client does get that and they know they cannot catch up on the rent, take that time period to leave, because the last thing you want to do is have an eviction on your background. So this is kind of like a grace period. So if you know you can't catch up on your rent, that's a good time to probably exit and vacate before they file the eviction. So this is kind of like a grace period before they actually file the eviction. The interesting thing about the removal of the tenant, the only way a tenant can be removed from or unit is when a landlord wins an eviction lawsuit against the tenant. Even then, the landlord is not the one who can actually remove the tenant items. Only a law enforcement officer has that authority. I've seen landlords who have harassed tenants and physically remove their things out the unit, and they had no legal right to do that. So just FYI, only a law enforcement person can remove a tenant's items out of a unit, not a landlord. Next slide, please. Next, I think we skipped one, the move in and move out process. There we go. So let's talk about the move-in process. If the tenant, if there's certain utilities the tenant is responsible for, most properties will require you to provide proof that you have transferred the utilities in your name before they would actually sign a lease. So you need to make sure before you sign a lease, what are you required to submit to your landlord during the lease signing, because they won't even let you sign a lease unless you have proof that the utilities have been signed over in your name. Again, we talked about renter insurance. Again, that varies from landlord to landlord. Some require you to show the declaration that you've gotten the actual renter insurance before you can sign the lease and move in. I always recommend that you do the walkthrough with your client. There's going to be a punch list they're given to show what they're looking at, and there's a certain time period with that punch list that they have to turn it in, and also take pictures. So when you do the walkthrough, take pictures and do the punch list and turn it in with the pictures, so you can verify if there's some things you dispute or things that you need that the client needs fixed in a unit, you have proof of that to give to the landlord. So with the move-out process, this is, again, there's going to be a punch list. The notice to vacate, as we talked about early, knowing a company's notice to vacate is essential because the lease end date will determine when the notice should be given for the move-out. So let's look at Miss I Need a Home. Miss I Need a Home wants to move and decided to give her notice to vacate. So she's about to do her move-out. Her lease requires her to give 60 days notice before the end of the lease date. Her lease ends on 12/30/22. For her to comply with the lease terms, her notice to vacate should be submitted on 10/30/22. So that's very important. So if you know you have a client that does not want to renew their lease, they want to move out, this is part of the move out process, is to make sure that they give their notice to vacate and it follows in line with their lease conditions. Also make sure that they turn off their utilities, because the last thing you want to do is leave a unit, another family moves in and they're taking advantage of your utilities in your client's name, because I've seen that happen before. And when you do that, again, your move out, again, you're going to do that punch list. Some landlords, they use that same move-in punch list for your move-out punch list to do a comparison. So you want to make sure that you go ahead, do the walkthrough, and anything that you dispute, you take note of it. You take pictures of it, because the last thing you want to do is leave your landlord to do your walkthrough knowing there was no damage done, just basic wear and tear, and you turn around, you can't get your deposit back because you didn't do the walkthrough with your with the landlord. And also a forwarding address. Again, each state is different when it comes to when the deposit comes back to the tenant. So you have to look at what is your state requirements when, after you move out, what is the requirements for your landlord to return your deposits? You need to look at that as well. So the next slide, we're done almost. Next slide, community resources. Here are a few resources that I keep on hand when I was doing case management when it came to housing for my clients. If I found that they were falling a little bit in trouble with their rent, 211, it provides information on community, not just rent, community-based health services, social and government services in their area. And then also the 311 is used in larger cities to access information or municipality services. If you have a client that's leasing up a house, they need to know, well, who I contact to pick up my garbage. That would be a good number to use, the 311. and contact the local United Way. They are the hub of all the services in that area. I also suggest community development corporations. There are nonprofits like Catholic Charities, Salvation Army, and Lutheran Social Services. They have rental assistance programs when the funding is there. And then also you can visit the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, and that will show you funding that's available in those counties. Next slide. Any questions? Let's stay within time.
Lynette, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, the first question in the questions tab is just if we can provide the slides for this webinar. And yeah, everyone who's on this webinar, everyone who registered will get a copy of the presentation as well as a video or a link to a video. So just wanted to clarify that for everyone. There still is a little bit of time. There are a couple of questions in the questions tab, but there is a little bit of time for you to add if you have any questions for Lynette. Right now, I'll go to the second question here, which someone's asking, what about if a landlord sells the property and then the new landlord wants to increase the rent? How do we navigate that, or what sorts of rules are in place for that?
They have to, again, that varies from state to state because they have to give advance a certain amount of notice before they can do the the rental increase. So again, each state it varies. So yeah, that has happened before. And also with that particular question, if a landlord is selling their property, they also have to give their tenants notification that it's going to exchange hands to a new owner.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, there's probably some sort of clause in the original lease, that outlines sort of what some of that process might be if the property sells. So I would assume that might be included in there to look at what kinds of notice or how many days, that kind of thing. If anyone else has another question, please feel free to jump. Okay, here, hold on. Let's see. Let's hold on one sec. This person's asking suggestions for finding housing for refugees in very tight markets, like, for example, San Diego. This person is.
That's not difficult. I think that's a good thing. We're still brainstorming as refugee housing solutions of tight markets such as San Francisco. I always think outside the box. I've lived in larger cities. Sometimes we don't even think about mobile homes, especially with larger families, mobile homes, small homes. I don't know how popular they are in the San Francisco area. But those are, we're still thinking about how you navigate finding affordable housing in those larger cities. So I really, that's a working question. But one thing I found when I lived in Dallas, especially with the larger families, was the mobile home option, the manufactured homes as well. So that was one of the options I used, especially because it's very difficult to house the larger families.
Yeah, and Lynette, maybe if there, refugee housing solutions as a whole, I'm wondering if people are just aware of your organization and what sorts of services you all can provide, or if there's anything that you all do with community members, community partners, or with local affiliate offices helping to sort of expand their access to affordable housing in their area, including when it's really tight. Are there other programs or initiatives that are going on through refugee housing?
We're going to be doing the regional housing communities of practice because, again, we know each territory and each area is slightly different. And even though we're all dealing with finding available affordable housing, our problems are slightly different versus the Midwest versus in the South. So we have decided to start this regional housing community of practice to bring people in different regions together to become this think tank and say, okay, this is what's going on in our region. What have you found that's helpful? So we can come up with some innovative solutions to housing. So if you can go on our website, you can see which region you belong to when we're going to do our regional housing communities of practice. We encourage you because it's kind of almost like per region. and then we're gonna collect that information. So, okay, this is what they did in the Midwest. Have you guys thought about doing this over in this region? So taking those things through those meetings and sharing them with other regions, but also giving other regions to speak to other practitioners to see all the issues they're dealing with as well.
That's great, and I'll include that in the email, just as a reminder, and a link to your website so that people have access to that and can follow up if they want to be included in those sorts of communities of practice and things like that. So we'll include that. I'm going to get to the next question here. Do you have an example of a letter of support from a resettlement agency or a promissory note from a resettlement agency or something
Yes,
like that? Do you have a template or anything like that?
Yes, we do. That's part of Refugee Housing Solutions. We are trying to provide these resources for resettlement agencies to have, not just them, but also for property managers and landlords. So you go to our website, and also we're going to be providing technical assistance where you can book a one-on-one assistance with us in advance. We prefer it in advance because if you have a question, we need to do our research. We want to make sure we're prepared for your one-on-one session. So we have those things as well on our website. And we're still in our infancy stage, so we're still learning, we're still growing, and we're still receiving resources from other agencies and best practices. We're learning as well.
That's great. The next question is, does notice of entry have to be stipulated in the lease to ensure the landlord gives notice before entering, or is this a blanket right regardless of the rental agreement or not?
No, it has to be in the lease. Only time that a landlord can enter, like for example, if the lease says we will give you 24-hour notice before we enter your unit, that's in the lease. However, if there's some maintenance emergency, then they can enter the unit. Like if they have getting a complaint from another tenant and there's water coming down my ceiling, then they have every legal right to enter the unit. But if they're going in there just to like let the bug man in, they have to give them notification before they let someone in the unit.
Gotcha. So an emergency, that there's sort of an understanding that it's a reasonable thing for them to do in case of an emergency, a fire,
but for a landlord to be popping up,
something like that.
Unexpectedly in the unit without advance notification, that's harassment.
Yeah, great. Whoops, sorry, one sec here. It's just saying, please add me to your list. I use someone else's link. Sure. Yeah, if you include that in there, that's fine. And so yes, yes, I wrote down your email earlier. Also, Lynette said that the letter is posted on her website. Please give us that website or a name for organization. So yeah, Lynette is with Refugee Housing Solutions, and your website is.
We're gonna look at that.
I want to say it's Refugee.
Yeah, if you just type in Refugee Housing Solution, it'll pop up.
Yeah, but we'll include that in the email for sure. Hold on one sec. Yes, no problem, Kyo. Let's see. Are there any more questions before we go here? Awesome, thank you. Sylvia says this is amazing. We appreciate that kind of feedback. Thank you so much, Sylvia. Yeah, I think we'll end it here. So give me just a second and I'll kind of read a little spiel. Yeah, just want to say thanks again to Lynette Pearl from Refugee Housing Solutions. And thank you to everyone for attending today's RWC Lunch and Learn. If you have any other questions, you can contact us at info@refugeewelcome.org. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording of today's webinar, as well as descriptions of more upcoming RWC Lunch and Learns. On behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day. Thank you all. Thank you, Lynette.